Moments after this torpedo was launched, Japanese naval doctrine, built on pride, denial, and decades of arrogance, collapsed in seconds. Dawn breaks over the Pacific, 1944. The sea is glass smooth, reflecting pink and gold. On the bridge of the massive Japanese flagship, Admiral Takahashi stands with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the sunrise with the confidence of a man who has never known defeat. His uniform is pristine, his posture perfect. Around him, junior officers laugh at a shared joke. One mentions submarines, those crude American vessels lurking in the depths, and the admiral waves his hand dismissively. Submarines, he says with a slight smile, are a coward's weapon. They hide in the darkness because they cannot face us in honest battle. The Imperial Navy was built on honor, on surface combat, on decisive action. These underwater toys are irrelevant against our power. His officers nod in agreement. Why wouldn't they? The flagship beneath their feet displaces over 30,000 tons. Its guns can hurl shells 20 miles. It has survived battles, storms, and years of war. It is, in every sense, invincible. But 600 feet below the surface, in crushing darkness and suffocating heat, a very different scene unfolds. Inside the cramped control room of an American submarine, 23 men barely breathe. The air is thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and fear. Condensation drips from pipes overhead. The temperature hovers near 47 degrees Celsius. Every surface is slick with moisture. A young sailor wipes his palms on his already soaked uniform and grips a valve wheel tighter. Another stares at a depth gauge, watching the needle tremble. The captain, a lean man with dark circles under his eyes and 3 days of stubble, whispers into the speaking tube. His voice is barely audible, but every man hears it clearly in the suffocating silence. Armed torpedo tube 1. A sailor's hands move with practiced precision, turning switches, checking pressure gauges. There's a soft mechanical hum, then a click. The torpedo is ready. In the tube, a Mark 14 torpedo, 20 feet long, 3,000 pounds of steel and explosives, waits in the darkness. Above them, unaware, the flagship glides forward. The captain closes his eyes for just a moment. He's calculating distances, speeds, angles. He's thinking about his crew, about their families back home, about the dozen ways this could go catastrophically wrong. He's thinking about the admiral on that flagship who doesn't believe submarines matter. He opens his eyes. Fire. The torpedo launches with a compressed air explosion that shakes the entire submarine. Bubbles rush past the hull. Then silence. The torpedo is gone, racing through the water at 46 knots, an invisible predator cutting through the darkness towards its target. But we don't see the impact yet. Not yet. Because first you need to understand how we got here. You need to understand the collision of two worldviews, two ways of war, two generations of naval thinking. You need to understand why that admiral was so confident, why that submarine crew was so desperate, and why the next 30 seconds would change naval warfare forever. This is the story of how Japanese admirals mocked submarines until one sank their flagship. This is a story about pride meeting innovation, tradition colliding with technology, and the moment when arrogance became catastrophe. This isn't just military history. This is human drama, a ticking clock thriller told through the eyes of men on both sides of an impossible shot. Let's go back to the beginning. The Japanese Imperial Navy in 1944 was built on a foundation of honor, tradition, and an almost religious devotion to the battleship. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized one central concept: the decisive surface battle, fleet facing fleet, guns thundering across open water, victory or death determined by courage, seamanship, and overwhelming firepower. This wasn't just strategy, it was philosophy, it was cultural identity. Japanese naval officers were trained from their first day at the academy that true naval combat happened on the surface, in daylight, where men could see their enemy and face them with honor. The battleship was the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a floating fortress, a symbol of national power, a weapon that could sink anything it could see. And submarines? Submarines were something else entirely.
They lurked beneath the waves. They struck from hiding. They avoided fair combat. In the eyes of many senior Japanese officers, submarines represented everything dishonorable about modern warfare. They were useful for reconnaissance, perhaps. They could scout enemy positions, report fleet movements, serve as auxiliary vessels. But as weapons of war? As tools to sink capital ships? The very idea was almost offensive.
Admiral Takahashi embodied this thinking perfectly. He had spent 40 years in the Imperial Navy. He had commanded destroyers, cruisers, and now this magnificent flagship. He had studied at the finest naval academies, absorbed the teachings of Admiral Togo, memorized the lessons of Tsushima Strait, where the Japanese fleet had annihilated the Russians in 1905. Everything in his training, everything in his experience told him that submarines were a sideshow, a minor threat at best, a coward's weapon at worst. On this particular morning, as his flagship prepared to transit from one island base to another, he felt nothing but confidence. The route was well planned. Escorts would join them at sunrise. The Americans were hundreds of miles away, their forces scattered. It would be a routine journey, perhaps even pleasant. The weather was perfect. He looked out at the calm sea and smiled. 600 feet below, the American submarine had been hunting for 72 hours straight. The contrast couldn't be more extreme. While the flagship was spacious, well-ventilated, equipped with officers' cabins and a proper galley, the submarine was a steel tube of barely controlled chaos. Every inch of space was utilized. Men slept in bunks stacked 3 high, so close you could touch the man above you by simply raising your hand. The galley was a single hot plate and a coffee pot. The head, the bathroom, was a tiny compartment that could barely fit one person, and using it required 3 other crew members to operate valves and pumps. The smell was overwhelming. Diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, cooking grease, battery acid, and the peculiar metallic tang of recycled air. After 3 days submerged, the oxygen was thin. Every breath felt insufficient. Men moved slowly to conserve energy. Some experienced headaches that wouldn't stop until they could surface and crack the hatches. The heat was worse than the smell. The submarine's diesel engines generated enormous amounts of heat, and that heat had nowhere to go. It radiated through the hull, turned the interior into a steel oven. Men's uniforms were perpetually soaked through, some stripped to just shorts, their skin glistening with sweat. The deck plates were slippery. Touching metal could burn your hand. And the noise, or rather, the lack of it. When they were hunting, when they were trying to remain undetected, the entire crew operated in near total silence. Orders were whispered, movements were slow and deliberate. A dropped wrench could give away their position. A cough could be a death sentence. Men learned to breathe quietly, to swallow instead of clearing their throats, to communicate with hand signals and meaningful glances. The captain had been awake for 36 hours straight. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and coffee, but his mind remained sharp. He stood in the control room, studying charts, listening to sonar reports, calculating probabilities. They had been tracking radio intercepts for days, piecing together fragments of Japanese communications, trying to predict where high-value targets might appear. And then, 16 hours ago, they had intercepted a message. Encrypted, of course, but the pattern was recognizable. A flagship, moving from one anchorage to another. The route was predictable. It had to be. The island geography dictated certain passages, certain channels deep enough for large ships. The captain had made his decision immediately. They would race ahead, position themselves along the projected route, and wait. It was a desperate gamble. If the Japanese changed course, if escorts appeared earlier than expected, if their calculations were even slightly wrong, they would get nothing but a wasted opportunity and depleted batteries. But if they were right? The crew understood what was at stake. They drove the submarine hard, running on the surface through the night to recharge batteries and make speed, diving before dawn to avoid aircraft. They pushed machinery to its limits. The engineers worked in shifts, monitoring temperatures, adjusting flow rates, coaxing every possible knot out of aging equipment. And now, finally, they were in position. The sonar operator, a 22-year-old kid from Nebraska who had never seen the ocean until he enlisted, sat with headphones clamped over his ears, listening to the vast emptiness of the Pacific.
He heard the clicking of shrimp, the distant groaning of whales, the subtle thermoclines where water temperatures changed. And then he heard something else, something mechanical, something big. "Contact," he whispered. "Bearing 270, heavy screws, single large vessel." The control room exploded in silent activity. Men moved to battle stations without a word. The captain grabbed his plotting board, started calculating angles. The helmsmen adjusted their position with tiny, precise movements. The torpedo officer began his pre-firing checklist.
Above them, unaware, the flagship came closer. The Admiral was in his cabin now, enjoying breakfast. Fresh rice, grilled fish, miso soup. He ate slowly, savoring the meal, reading intelligence reports. The Americans were in disarray, he read. Their submarines were running low on supplies. Their surface fleet was scattered across multiple operations. The Pacific, for now, remained Japan's ocean. He set down his chopsticks and looked at his watch. They would rendezvous with the escort destroyers in less than an hour. Until then, the morning was peaceful. Perfect. On the bridge, his officers maintained watch out of discipline rather than concern. The sea was empty, the sky was clear. Some junior officers used the calm moment to practice navigation calculations. One wrote a letter home to his wife. Another simply stood at the railing, breathing the fresh air, watching flying fish skip across the waves. None of them imagined that 600 feet below, a submarine was rising slowly toward firing depth. The American captain watched the depth gauge wind backward. 400 feet, 300, 200. They had to be shallow enough for the torpedoes to work properly, but deep enough to avoid visual detection. It was a narrow window, and they were threading it with mechanical precision. "Depth 120 feet, the diving officer whispered. "Trim, stable." The captain nodded. He raised the periscope, a careful, slow movement that wouldn't create wake or vibration. The optical tube rose from its well, and he pressed his face against the eyepiece, peering into the dawn light. And there it was, the flagship, enormous, powerful, beautiful in its way. The rising sun glinted off its superstructure, its wake spread in a wide V behind it. The captain could see figures on the bridge, tiny, distant, unaware. He could see the flags flying from its mast, the gun turrets pointing fore and aft, the armor belt along its waterline. He began calling out observations in a rapid, practiced monotone. Bearing, angle, speed, range. The fire control team plotted the solution on mechanical computers, ancient analog devices that translated observations into firing coordinates. Gears turned, dials spun, and slowly, achingly slowly, the targeting solution converged. Range 4,500 yards, speed 12 knots, angle on the bow 15 degrees port. The fire control officer adjusted his calculations. "Solution ready, Captain. Recommend spread of 3 torpedoes." The captain hesitated. 3 torpedoes meant 3 chances to hit, but also 3 chances to be detected, 3 trails of bubbles leading back to their position. And they only had 18 torpedoes total. Once those were gone, they'd have to return to base, a journey of thousands of miles through hostile waters. But this was a flagship. This was the kind of target that could justify an entire patrol. This was what they had been hunting for. "Set depth 12 feet, he ordered. "Spread pattern 5-degree interval. Prepared tubes 1, 2, and 3. "Aye, Captain. Tubes 1, 2, and 3 ready." The captain took one more look through the periscope. The flagship was closer now, its details sharper. He could see the wear on its hull, the rust streaks despite fresh paint, the signs of years at war. He could see a sailor on deck, smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing. In a few seconds, that sailor's world would end. The captain lowered the periscope. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered. Compressed air exploded into the tube, shoving 3,000 pounds of torpedo out into the ocean. The weapon's motor kicked in immediately, propellers spinning up to speed, and it began its run, a 1,500-yard sprint toward the flagship's hull. Fire 2.
Another shutter, another torpedo away. Fire 3! The third weapon launched cleanly. 3 tracks in the water now, 3 mechanical predators racing toward their target. The captain raised the periscope again, watching, counting seconds in his head. The torpedoes were incredibly fast, incredibly loud to anyone listening underwater, but almost invisible from the surface. Just thin wakes, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. And nobody on the flagship was looking. 40 seconds to impact. On the flagship's bridge, an officer noticed something odd. A disturbance in the water about 2,000 yards away. Just a ripple, maybe a dolphin, maybe nothing. He started to raise his binoculars. 30 seconds. The Admiral finished his breakfast, set his napkin aside, and stood. He would return to the bridge, check their position, ensure the morning's transit went smoothly. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his cap. 20 seconds. In the submarine, every man held his breath. The captain watched through the periscope, motionless, barely blinking. The sonar operator could hear the torpedoes running, could hear the flagship's screws churning, could hear the 2 sounds converging.
10 seconds. The officer on the bridge finally raised his binoculars, focused on the disturbance. His eyes widened. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. 5 seconds. Too late. The first torpedo struck the flagship on its port side, just aft of the forward turret. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive column of water shot 200 feet into the air, carrying with it pieces of hull plating, deck equipment, and bodies. The blast wave traveled through the ship's structure at supersonic speed, shattering bulkheads, rupturing pipes, collapsing passageways. 2 seconds later, the second torpedo hit, slightly further aft. This one struck near the boiler room. The ship's own fuel oil ignited, creating a secondary explosion that ripped through 3 decks simultaneously. Steam pipes burst, filling compartments with superheated vapor. Men died instantly, scalded or crushed or thrown against steel walls. The third torpedo missed. It ran just slightly too deep, passing beneath the keel. But 2 hits were more than enough. The flagship shuddered like a living thing in agony. Its bow dipped sharply as the forward compartments flooded. Alarm bells rang throughout the ship. Men scrambled from below decks, some burned, some bleeding, all terrified. The lights flickered and died as electrical systems failed. Emergency lighting kicked in, painting everything in eerie red. On the bridge, the Admiral grabbed a railing to keep from falling. He stared in shock at the smoke pouring from his ship's side. It was impossible. They were in open water, in daylight, with clear weather. How could this happen? And then understanding dawned, terrible and complete. A submarine. It had been a submarine. The weapon he had mocked, the threat he had dismissed, had just crippled his flagship with 2 perfectly placed shots. The damage control parties rushed to contain the flooding, but it was hopeless. The explosions had torn holes 20 feet wide in the hull. Water poured in at thousands of gallons per second. The pumps couldn't keep up. Watertight doors were sealed, sacrificing men trapped below to save the rest, but even that wasn't enough. The flagship was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. The Admiral stood on the tilting bridge, watching his officers work frantically to save the ship, knowing it was futile. His face was ashen. His hands, which had been steady for 40 years of service, trembled. The pride of the Imperial Navy, the symbol of Japanese sea power, was going down because of a single submarine, a weapon he had considered beneath his notice. The irony was not lost on him. But while the flagship's crew fought their losing battle, the submarine faced its own crisis. The moment the torpedoes exploded, every escort ship within 50 miles knew exactly where the submarine was. The torpedo tracks pointed back like arrows. Destroyers that had been cruising leisurely suddenly kicked up to flank speed, racing toward the attack position. Their sonar operators activated their equipment, sending powerful pings into the water, searching for the submarine's metal hull. Inside the submarine, the celebrations of a successful hit lasted approximately 3 seconds. Destroyers inbound, multiple contacts, high speed, bearing 110 and 235. Dive, dive, dive!
the captain roared, the first loud voice in hours. "Take her down to 400 feet, emergency speed." The diving officer grabbed controls, flooding ballast tanks, angling diving planes down hard. The submarine's bow dropped sharply. Men grabbed whatever was nearby to keep from falling. Equipment not properly secured crashed to the deck. The depth gauge needle swung downward rapidly. 150 feet, 200, 250. The first depth charge exploded. If you've never experienced a depth charge attack, you cannot imagine it. The sound is beyond description, a bass frequency boom that you feel in your bones, in your teeth, in your skull. The pressure wave hits the hull like a physical blow. Light bulbs shatter, pipes crack, men are thrown from their feet. Everything that isn't bolted down becomes a projectile. And then another, and another. The destroyers above were dropping charges in patterns, trying to bracket the submarine's position. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the water. The submarine's hull groaned. Metal plates flexing, rivets popping. Cork insulation rained down from overhead. A pipe split, spraying seawater into the control room until someone got a wrench on it. "Depth 300 feet, the diving officer reported, his voice shaking. "Hull integrity holding." "Go deeper," the captain ordered. 500 feet.
The crew exchanged glances. The submarine was rated for 450 feet maximum depth. Below that, the pressure could crush the hull like an aluminum can, but staying at 300 meant staying in the kill zone for the depth charges. 500 feet. Aye, the diving officer said quietly and pushed the planes down further. 350 feet. 400. 450. The hull began making sounds no one wanted to hear, creaking, groaning, metallic pops as pressure pushed against riveted seams. Small leaks appeared, streams of water shooting through microscopic gaps. Crew members stuffed rags into the leaks, wrapped tape around pipes, did anything to slow the water. 470 feet. Another depth charge exploded, closer this time. The entire submarine rang like a bell. A gauge glass shattered, spraying hydraulic fluid. A crew member screamed as a steam line burst, scalding his arm. The pharmacist's mate rushed over with bandages. 490 feet. "Level off," the captain ordered. They couldn't go deeper. The hull was already pushed beyond its limits. Another 50 feet and they might implode. The submarine hung in the darkness, silent except for the groaning metal and the drip of water. Above, they could hear the destroyer's screws churning, a sound like a distant train, getting closer, then farther, then closer again. The sonar pings hammered against them. Each ping felt like an accusation, a spotlight finding them in the darkness. And then the depth charges began falling again. The pattern was methodical, terrifying. The destroyers would ping until they got a return. Then they would race to that position and drop a spread of charges. Then they would listen for breaking up noises, the sound of a submarine's hull collapsing. If they didn't hear it, they would search again. The American crew could only sit in silence, wait, and hope. Men prayed, men cried silently. Men stared at nothing, faces blank with terror they couldn't show. The captain walked through the submarine, making eye contact with each crew member, nodding, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. The boat was hurt. They were deep, too deep. The destroyers were persistent, and their battery power was draining with every minute that passed. Another depth charge. This one felt like it was right on top of them. The submarine twisted in the water. Lights went out completely for 5 seconds, before emergency power kicked in. When the lights returned, everyone looked at each other with wide eyes, wondering if the next one would be the last. But slowly, so slowly it was hard to notice at first, the explosions began to come less frequently. 5 minutes between blasts, then 10, then 15. The sonar operator lifted one headphone cautiously. "Destroyer screws fading, Captain. Bearing away to the north." The captain didn't allow himself to hope. Not yet. Maintain silent running. Hold this depth. They waited another hour, the longest hour of their lives. The only sounds were the drip of leaks, the quiet hum of electric motors, and the rasp of 23 men trying to breathe quietly. The air was getting worse. Thin, stale, thick with carbon dioxide. Some men's lips were turning blue. Finally, the sonar operator spoke again. "All contacts lost, Captain. I think they've given up." "Slow rise," the captain ordered. "Take us up to 200 feet, slowly." The submarine began its ascent, creeping upward foot by foot. At 200 feet, they leveled off. The captain raised the periscope and did a full sweep of the horizon. Empty sea. No destroyers, no aircraft. Just waves and sky. "Surface the boat," he said quietly. They blew ballast tanks and rose into daylight. The moment the hatch was cracked, fresh air rushed in like a gift from heaven. Men gasped, filling their lungs, some coughing from the sudden oxygen. The captain climbed to the bridge and took his first real breath in hours. Behind them, miles away, the Japanese flagship had disappeared beneath the waves. The sinking of the flagship sent shockwaves through the Japanese naval command that went far beyond the loss of one ship. It wasn't the material loss that hurt most. The Imperial Navy had lost ships before. It was what the loss represented. For years, Japanese naval doctrine had been built on specific assumptions. Surface combat was decisive. Battleships were supreme. Submarines were auxiliary weapons. Officers had been trained under this doctrine, promoted under this doctrine, made strategic decisions based on this doctrine. And in one morning, one submarine had proven the entire framework wrong. The admiral who had dismissed submarines as cowardly weapons went down with his ship. He had refused to abandon it until the very end, standing on the tilting bridge as water rose around his ankles. Some said it was honor, others said it was shame. Maybe it was both.
But his death didn't change what happened. It didn't erase the fact that a weapon considered barely relevant had destroyed one of the Imperial Navy's most powerful vessels in a matter of minutes. It didn't change the fact that all the armor, all the guns, all the training and tradition hadn't mattered against two well-placed torpedoes. In the weeks that followed, Japanese naval strategy began to shift. Convoy routes were changed to avoid known submarine patrol areas. Anti-submarine warfare suddenly became a priority rather than an afterthought. Resources were diverted from battleship construction to destroyer production. Training programs were revised. But the changes came slowly, reluctantly, because they required admitting fundamental errors in judgment. They required senior officers to acknowledge that their contempt for submarine warfare had been misplaced. They required a cultural shift in how the Imperial Navy saw itself and its role. And by the time those changes were implemented, it was too late to alter the course of the war. The American submarine campaign in the Pacific had already grown to full strength. Submarines were cutting Japan's supply lines, sinking merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced, strangling the island nation's ability to import food, fuel, and raw materials. The flagship wasn't the last capital ship to fall to submarines. It was just the most symbolic, the moment when pride met reality and reality won. The American submarine returned to base 3 weeks later, having expended all its torpedoes and pushed its equipment to the breaking point. The crew looked like ghosts, gaunt, exhausted, aged beyond their years, but they had survived, and they had sunk a flagship. The captain wrote his report in the spare, technical language that military reports require: coordinates, times, weather conditions, torpedo performance. But late one night, alone in his cabin, he wrote a letter to his wife that he never sent. In it, he tried to explain what it felt like to hunt something so much larger than yourself, to fire weapons knowing the retaliation would be immediate and possibly fatal, to survive by luck as much as skill. I think about the men on that ship. I know they were the enemy. I know they would have killed us without hesitation. But they were still men. They had families. They believed in something bigger than themselves. And I killed them because that's what war is. I don't feel proud of it. I don't feel guilty. I just feel tired. He never sent the letter.
He sealed it in an envelope and put it in a drawer where it would be found decades later by his grandchildren. The crew was given 2 weeks of leave, then sent back out on another patrol. Some volunteered for additional tours. Some requested transfer to surface ships unable to bear the thought of returning to the cramped darkness. All of them carried the memory of those hours at 500 feet, listening to depth charges explode, wondering which one would be the last sound they ever heard. War changes men. Submarines change the nature of naval warfare. But the story of that morning, the confident admiral and the desperate submarine, the collision of pride and innovation, that story became something larger. It became a lesson about the danger of assuming your way is the only way, about the risk of dismissing new technologies because they don't fit your worldview, about the price of arrogance. So what does this story mean? Why does it matter beyond the immediate tactical and strategic implications? Because this pattern repeats throughout history. Established powers dismissing new threats until it's too late. Traditions becoming prisons rather than guides. Pride blinding leaders to changing realities. The Japanese admirals weren't stupid. They weren't cowards. They were products of their training, their culture, their experience. Everything they knew told them submarines were minor threats, and they were wrong. But not because they were incompetent. They were wrong because the world had changed faster than they could adapt. The submarine crews weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men pushed into extraordinary circumstances. They suffered, they feared, they sometimes failed, but they adapted. They innovated. They found ways to make ancient equipment work beyond its design limits. They developed tactics through trial and error and survival. This is the tension at the heart of all warfare, all competition, all human progress. The established versus the innovative, the traditional versus the adaptive, the proud versus the pragmatic. The Flagship represented centuries of naval tradition, beautiful, powerful, symbol of national strength. The submarine represented the future, crude, uncomfortable, but devastatingly effective. When those two forces collided, tradition lost. Not because tradition was worthless, but because tradition alone couldn't adapt to new realities. And here's the deeper lesson. The Japanese Navy had submarines. They built them, deployed them, used them, but they never fully believed in them. They never gave submarine warfare the same weight as surface combat. They never trained their submarine commanders with the same intensity they trained battleship captains. They had the technology, but not the mindset. The Americans, by contrast, embraced submarine warfare completely. They invested in it, refined it, pushed it to its limits. They developed new tactics, new equipment, new training programs. They took submarines seriously as weapons of war, not as auxiliary scouts. And that mindset difference, that willingness to believe in something new, made the strategic difference. This is what leadership means in times of change. Not just having the right tools, but being willing to use them. Not just seeing new possibilities, but acting on them. Not just understanding intellectually that the world has changed, but emotionally accepting it and adapting your behavior. The admiral on the Flagship understood submarines existed. He just didn't believe they mattered. And that distinction between knowing and believing cost him his life and his ship.